This is the Pyxis 6K. It is my new favorite cinema camera made by Blackmagic Design. It's their new box style iteration from their previous pocket lineup, which are still fantastic cameras, but with a design that leans more towards a form factor centered around better ergonomics. I'm coming up on 5 months with the Pyxis 6K, and my history with Blackmagic actually goes even further back. It starts with the original cinema camera, the weird rectangle shaped one that you stuck actual solid state drives into. So owning this camera and getting to this form factor now, it's pretty amazing to see how far we've come. It was a very weird camera at the time, but it was my first experience with a raw workflow. Using cinema DNG files, it had an acclaimed 13 stops of dynamic range and can shoot in 2K up to 30 frames per second. I know, amazing. But most of the software available at that time couldn't even import those cinema DNG files, so I mostly shot on ProRes with this camera. Fast forward through the years and here we are. I purchased a camera that at first I was completely ignoring because I thought I had moved on. I wanted to explore everything else out there and find something that fit that box style. I had purchased a used Komodo and I was absolutely in love with it. That was until it broke. And now with Red's recent price drop, that repair cost back then was just a few $100s less than the price of a brand new Komodo. Back in October, the release date for the Pyxis was approaching, and while my Red Komodo was getting fixed, I was swiftly reminded about why I just love Blackmagic's products. So let's talk about body design. While the pocket style cameras felt plasticky, this one does not, like at all. It has a heft to it that isn't too heavy, but it's not too light. It honestly just doesn't feel like a toy. It feels really good in the hands. I purchased some mounting accessories that feel just right and don't feel like they make the camera any bigger than its original design, and allows me to keep my setup minimal while giving me the option to make it a more complex rig. The inputs on this body are what really sold me though, even though I'd owned the Red and honestly used a bunch of other cameras. A USB for monitoring, an SDI for monitoring or wireless transmission, a timecode port, Ethernet, USB for SSDs, XLR with phantom power, a 3.5 audio port, and dual CF Express B slots. But best of all, nearly all these ports you can jam timecode into. This was honestly the deciding factor, and I know it sounds extremely niche, but for me, I have a timecode based workflow where I record my audio separately from the camera because I like to use 32-bit flow audio, or I'll have somebody else on set recording audio for me, and this is just the easiest and best and cleanest way to sync audio in post versus auto sync, which is honestly really good these days. But this is the issue that I had with my Komodo. This is what broke on my Komodo and cost nearly the price of a brand new Komodo to replace. So knowing that I have a camera where if one port breaks, pretty much every other port on the camera can act as a backup. I also work in a broadcast and documentary settings using a ton of different Blackmagic products, so this camera just makes sense. Now, is this camera perfect? No, but it does work for me in my workflow, which is essentially all that matters. But at the time of recording this video, I'm pretty sure Blackmagic has or is soon to announce a newer version of this camera fixing all these issues. But that's what's great about Blackmagic. They listen to their users and they address the issues quickly whilst not charging you your life savings to purchase their products. But with that said, let's get into some of the nitpicks about this camera that I can honestly live without. I wish it had better button placement, like a recording button on both sides of the cameras, or a side handle that could trigger recording, like the Condor Blue side trigger wing handle. It could benefit from NDs, but most shoots I'm on, we have matte boxes with IRND or generally a very good variable ND filter, so that's not a deal breaker. I would love to see other USB inputs that have both the monitor and the viewfinder plugged up and mounted at the same time. Better integration of an iPhone app for control over Bluetooth, but now that I have the Pyxis monitor and I have an entire video on that, it's great. It's like really amazing. A few other things is just better sensor readout and internals for improved frame rates and rolling shutter performance, 2 XLR inputs like the other cinema cameras have, and ProRes, just because ProRes. When it comes to image quality out of this camera, honestly, there's not much to say. It's amazing. But for those who don't know, Blackmagic is the industry lead and standard when it comes to color grading software. They've been this for quite a long time. So you can trust that when they make a camera and a sensor, the color science going behind all of that is great, and you can trust it. It essentially ends up in the user's hands and creative discretion on how an image looks in the end. But with all that said, 6K Open Gate is fantastic. I love it, and it's something that's essential to my workflow. Because social media exists and not everyone knows how to turn a phone sideways to watch our masterpieces, we eternally have to compromise to make vertical content for their pleasure. Low light performance and dynamic range is also amazing on this camera. I feel like there's room for improvement in terms of the low light, but I did an entire video on that you guys can go back and watch. But with all that said, low light doesn't mean no light. If I'm ever in a situation on a documentary project where light just simply isn't available, I'm just gonna pick the proper camera for that job. I'm not gonna try and make something work that I know doesn't work, knowing that there are better options out there. But on the opposite end, if you're shooting indoors or outdoors and it's pretty much a daylight situation, you can trust that this camera will do very well and get the job done. To wrap this up, with Red announcing the recent price drop on the Komodo to essentially being the same price as the Pyxis, I think the Komodo is a great camera. I own one that I bought used, and since the price drop that brings it to the same price as the Pyxis, it's very likely that I'm not selling it because it would just be a total loss for me. And again, I work in an environment where I'm using up to 8 cameras at a time, so it definitely has its place for me. But in terms of camera comparison, it comes down to preference in the image and the user. The Komodo has a very good recognizable color science and global shutter, so you're gonna get a very cinematic image. And I'm not saying that you can't get that out of the Pyxis, but when it comes to motion, something about the sensor and the global shutter of the Komodo just has this very beautiful and unique look. Again, I shoot in a broadcast environment handheld, so that global shutter is definitely a benefit, but that's only something that honestly I, the user, knows, and it really doesn't benefit the viewer. I think the Pyxis is easier to rig and has more flexibility with its ports and an XLR for audio. If you're recording your audio separately, the Komodo can be a really amazing, small, compact run and gun setup. The codecs between both cameras vary, so honestly, it just depends on what you need for the content that you're creating. But note that the Komodo honestly is not cheap at all to accessorize. When it comes to buying a side handle or the monitor that are proprietary to the camera, you're going to end up spending a lot more money than you want to, whereas with the Pyxis, all the accessories are much more affordable and accessible. So in the end, should you buy the Pyxis 6K or whatever the next iteration is? I don't know what the next version has, but that won't make the Pyxis irrelevant. There's plenty of people out there who still love the original form factor of the cinema camera and end up preferring it for a lot of lightweight travel work. But what we as filmmakers need to recognize is that mostly everybody is still adapting to 4K TVs and watching most of our content on their phones. I think what I'm trying to say is any camera that was pretty much made within the last 8 years is still more than capable of being relevant in today's media climate. So if you were to ask me at the end of the day if I only had one choice between the Komodo and the Pyxis, the camera I think I would choose is